Thank you. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the GSNV series of practical wellness events. I would like to begin by, on behalf of the GSNV, acknowledging the traditional land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples, on which I am coming to you today from, and the lands that you are also on. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of country where you're at, and recognise the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities of culture, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders and to elders past, present, and for any of our First Nations peoples that are joining us here today. I'd like to, Jacqueline, if you could take us to just take a moment to introduce you to the GSNV team. Because I hope that you will see us out and about in different environments, and please come and talk to us, talk about our work. We have some key projects happening at the moment that we would love to share with you around. We are developing our new strategic plan. We have a genomics in schools program called The Science Within Us, which will launch next year, but it is about taking education to around genomics and using rare disease case studies from grade 5 to year 12. We have a whole new comms strategy going forward, so I hope you're seeing a real difference in how we are communicating our work to you, as well as sharing the work that amazing people in our community do as well. We have a focus on diversity and inclusiveness, both for our own operations, but also for how our patient support groups are able to provide that to their communities, and also to ensure that the stakeholders that we deal with and our community deals with has the capacity to be able to work with different communities as well. And finally, on our list of faces there, newest member of our team is Susie, and Susie is a research assistant who's joined the GSNV as part of an MRF project, which is about the ethical use of data. So kind of has quite a link into some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So just some housekeeping things. So and then I will introduce Jacqueline, and then we will get into the presentation. So please use the chat for any questions that you have. Jacqueline will give us instructions as to what she would like us to do throughout the presentations, but please tap into the chat to comment or to ask questions. Jacqueline, if you just let us know how you would like those handled. The slides will be circulated after the event, and I'll let Jacqueline talk about what else will be with those slides. There will be a evaluation at the end, so a short survey at the end that we'll put that in the chat, and we would greatly appreciate if you would provide us with some feedback about how you found this session. So I will now introduce Jack, and then we can get going. So let me introduce Jacqueline. So Dr. Jacqueline Savard, who is a senior lecturer in health, ethics and professionalism at Deakin University, and we're so delighted to have her expertise with us today. She spent the last 10 years studying direct-to-consumer testing in Australia. Really very interesting growth space as well over the last 10 years. And her research interests focused on the ethics of new genomic technologies and how genetic information is used in daily life. And Jacqueline's research examples examine how this information can be communicated and used to engage with the public. So who is a really important community that we need to bring along on this journey. So with that, over to you, Jacqueline, and everyone enjoy the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Monica, and welcome to all of our guests and attendees today. It's lovely to meet you all. Before we begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country because I am located elsewhere. So as we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place. And in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. Today, I'm located on Wadawurrung country, and on behalf of us all, I pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodians, elders, and ancestors of all the lands from which you may be joining our gathering today. I express our gratitude for their care of country, which continues to sustain us as it has done for millennia. Education has a long and rich heritage on this continent. We aim to honor and reflect the ways in which we teach and learn. So thank you, Monica, for that lovely introduction and a bit about me. As I'm sure you can hear, I'm not from around here. I am a visitor. I'm a newcomer to this land. I am originally from Canada, and I immigrated to Australia 18 years ago. So I have been here for a while, but the accent hangs on. My background, to give you a little bit of how it kind of all connects, is I came from sciences. I did a molecular genetics degree, loving my time in the laboratory, and I expanded that through my master's and PhD, looking at the ethics and bioethics of what we do and how we do it. My area of scholarship is on the ethics of genetics and genomics. I really am passionate about public engagement. I believe we need to have tools to communicate and engage across multiple different communities and publics. And the more we do that, the better we can all participate in the conversation. That's my fun passion part of my job. The day job, which pays the bills, is I'm also a lecturer within the Deakin School of Medicine, and I teach within the MD program there on health ethics and professionalism. So they all kind of feed into one another, and this is how I ended up here today with the privilege to speak with you. So a little bit about my approach to the webinar today. Number one, please interrupt. I know that everyone doesn't feel comfortable with speaking aloud. I do have the chat box open, so please feel free to type in questions. I've also got my Brady Bunch squares of pictures available, so if you want to raise your hand or use the emotions, whatever, the emoticons, whatever works for you, it's available. The chat function's there. A bit of rules of the game. I try to stay on mute if I'm not speaking. If you would like, I can turn the closed captions on, depending on preferences. The session is being recorded, so please choose your comfort level with the video being on or off. Generally, with the slides shared and me speaking, I'm kind of all that's going to be captured. But if you do pitch in to ask a question, it might switch and record your video. So whatever your comfort level is. Importantly, around ethics and bioethics, it's really important to know and to build a safe space for discussions. There might be some challenging ideas that are raised today, and if you need to take a moment to shut your camera off and just kind of let it percolate and think, please do take care of that. We also need to recognize that language sometimes doesn't encapsulate the full spectrum of what we want to talk about or what we mean. So if there's a terminology or the way something is referred to, it may not necessarily be a function of someone's beliefs, values, or preferences. It could just be that that's the best approach that we have for the language at the time. I am mindful of that, so if I do stop and kind of rewind to try to get the words right, please bear with me. My coffee is hitting bottom, but we've also got, a bit of time to go through, so I want to make sure that we're keeping to it as much as we can. Also today, Monica did mention that we have these slides available. So I'm putting into the chat box right now, if it will let me drop it. This is going to be a challenge. Get in there. That's not letting me drop it. That's interesting. I'm trying to share because I put together a Word document, which is kind of a workbook and notes that goes alongside with my slides today. I would rather you enjoy the presentation and engage and not try to catch up on notes. So I promise I have links and connections to all of those available for you. I'm just trying to get them uploaded. But before we get there, we're going to be using Mentimeter today. So please bear with me as I'm going to play jumping around between sharing screens. So I'm going to jump into Mentimeter and to share. You can access Mentimeter through in the chat box. And the
Jack,
code for it,
Jack, is it worth you emailing your slides and the document, and we'll put it into the chat? We'll have a try.
I can do that as well. So I am just going to get Mentimeter up so people can join Mentimeter and respond to the first question on the screen. And I'm going to try to get it added in right now. It's not allowing me. All right, I will email that through to Danielle right now. See, this is why I shouldn't have been chatting in the pre. I should have been sending and having all this set up and ready.
It didn't let you pick both answers.
I have too many screens. That's all right. Okay, so we've got a bit of experience and we've got none experience. That's okay. So one more question from you. When you hear ethics, what comes to mind? There are no right or wrong answers. Whatever you think comes to mind, add it in. And people got to Mentimeter, they're in, excellent. Values, kindness, fairness, excellent. These are all morals. This is all in the ballpark where we want to be. Fantastic. And I have one more question for you today. Well, for this suite, we will be coming back. So if you do keep Mentimeter just going to open in a side box, that's a really good approach. Well, informed in the best way to approach an ethical decision. Fantastic. We will go through that. Thought-provoking tools. I have some tools for you and some questions. Better supporting clients' decision-making. To know how to respond to questions, big or small, to best support others. Oh, a group after my own heart. Understand how to make better ethical decisions. These are great expectations to have. And thank you for sharing those with me, because I will keep that in mind as we progress through, and I will make sure that we come back to some of these touchstones to make sure that we're best serving you, because this webinar is about you and the tools and how I can best explain and support you today. And we're back to the presentation. Here we go. I've got my sizing. We are ready to go. A little bit about me. I can speak fast at points. So if I am going too fast, please raise your hand, type in the box saying, Jacqueline, you need to slow down. You're going at Mach speed. Please let me know. I'm always happy to slow down to make sure that everyone's kind of coming along with me. I always like to have an outline. So here is the broad idea of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with the role of genetic or genomic testing. I know some of it might be new knowledge for others. Others, they probably have heard this a million times before, but I like to make sure that we're all starting on the same page. I'm going to talk through the different types of genetic and genomic testing that is available and what we mean when we're talking about genetic or genomic information. Then I'm probably going to get to the crux of what you're thinking about. You know, someone is thinking about genetic or genomic testing. Now, what do we do? I'm going to then start unpacking about what I mean when I talk about ethics, because as you saw, we've all got different words that we associate with it and ways that we talk about it. Again, I want to come back to make sure that we're all kind of starting from the same starting point so we can understand what we're talking about, because I have a language around it, which may not be your language around it. So we're going to get some common terms that we can talk through. And then I want to kind of unpack a case study around genetic and genomic testing and the ethical considerations which might come into either advising, talking through an issue with someone, supporting someone if they're making a decision, and how you can organize approaching that. Because it can feel like a giant big ball of different considerations and factors. So I'm going to unpack it. This is by no means the only way that it can be unpacked, but it's a way that I think helps structure and helps you logically think through the different phases of testing and how you might think about different considerations. Getting into it, key terms today. So genetics, I'm going to broadly define as a study of heredity, which is inheritance from either, at the molecular level, we think about different characteristics we inherit from our family, potential risks of diseases or conditions, or perhaps, sometimes mannerisms. I know that when my sister and I are in the same room, it's a little bit scary. Bit of a spoiler alert, I have two older sisters who are identical twins, and you put me, we look like triplets, so it's a little bit unnerving sometimes. When we talk about genomics, it's going to be broadly defined as the study of genes, their functions, and related techniques. So that is a lot more of a broader terminology. I'm going to use those terms kind of side by side if I can today, because I know some prefer genetics, some prefer genomics. There's different schools of thought and philosophy. I'm just going to use them both because I feel that's just going to be easier. So when I am talking the main difference between genomics and genetics is that genetics to me will scrutinize the functioning and composition of a single gene, whereas genomics is going to be a bit more broadly, where it addresses all genes and their interrelationships to identify their combined influence on the growth and development of the organism. I know organism is a very bland way to say it because genomics does go across from bacteria through small non-human animals to non-human primates to humans. Again, there's the science background. I kind of look at the full spectrum. So genetic testing, as I'm going to talk about today, is going to be a type of medical test, and it's going to identify changes in the chromosome, genes, or proteins. And the results of a genetic test can confirm or rule out a suspected genetic condition or help determine a person's chance of developing or passing on a genetic disorder. That is a very narrow kind of remit that I'm using because it helps in terms of when we're thinking about different considerations. I will complicate this in the following slides, so bear with me. When we think about genome, I'm going to look at the examination of all genetic materials. That will be the coding and non-coding parts of an individual. Now, this might include looking at interactions between a particular component of a genome and other factors, such as environment, drugs, or other parts of the genome. So there is a little bit more of that complexity when we get to that genome and genomic level, that there's a lot more information, taking a lot more considerations into our analysis and how we're looking at things. All right. What do we view as the role of genetic or genomic testing? So there's different ways it can be used depending on the profession, the specialty, the questions being asked, and perhaps even the patient that's presenting. So it's important to remember that this is a tool, and it can be involved in the diagnosis, the prognosis, or investigation of clinical matters. I'm also going to put a little star there because it can also include non-clinical matters, and I'll explain this more when I talk about the types of genetic testing. When we think about this, results may be useful, so it can provide information to help narrow or expand the clinical investigation scope. It might be helpful in diagnosing a condition if there's a very specific question that's asked and answered by it. It also might provide information that helps with the prognosis, and that could either give information about the condition, the symptoms, or long-term impacts, which need to be considered for care or treatment plans. Results might also be useful in the future, so potentially for reproductive decisions, such as someone comes back to being a carrier for a condition and how that might influence their choices in the future. And this is the hard one. Results might be uncertain, or there might be no results, and I put in brackets at this time. We're at a really kind of interesting point in history where what we know and how we understand our genetics and genomics is changing almost daily. So knowing or not knowing something right now could change in a month, could change in 6 months. And those changes are going to have impacts upon the person who might seek testing, has done testing, or needs to think about the previous test results. And I really do come back to this last one, that it's important to note that testing may not provide definitive answers. I know we really want that medicine has a huge authority attached to it. If there's a test that might be good and therefore the test will give us an answer, Often that's not always the case, and that can be very challenging to reconcile that with hopes and expectations in terms of how you might support someone in that space, and also in terms of how you might support someone when they need to sit with that uncertainty. Types of testing available. This is where you get to some of the fun stuff. Apologies for the high terminology. This is just one way of framing it. There's also ways that we can provide further resources for understanding these. So starting with what we know, there's single gene testing, and this could mainly be used for the diagnosis and treatment purposes. So for example, I know it feels like low-hanging fruit, cystic fibrosis, which I'll also note is actually complex when you think about it because there's a lot of variants, but often it's you test, you're positive for a particular state of it, therefore you likely are going to be diagnosed with the condition. I'll also acknowledge that there's a huge scope for variation within there. It could be mild, it could be serious, the age of onset, and what things look like, we may not know. We've got SNPs, or what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms. This is usually done to collect information about genomic variation across several locations throughout the genome. This can often be used to calculate risk scores. So polygenic risk scores is one you might come across. It might also be looking at different sections of the genome where variation in those sections might be affiliated with a particular condition, or it might indicate that there's a certain condition that we need to investigate or be concerned about. There's also what we know as microarrays, which has a wider scope, and it looks for products or the expression of certain parts of the genome. These can be hard to interpret. I nod my head off to those technicians and specialists who use them because they are quite challenging. And they're used when we're looking at complex conditions, such as mosaicism might be present in a patient or a family. This can often be used in the pediatric setting to indicate developmental or health issues. They're not definitive again, but they're kind of one layer of the different ways that we can clinically investigate what is going on.
Jack, can I just ask you a quick question?
Yes.
So polygenic risk scores.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be when you have a test to see what the likelihood is that you are going to develop breast cancer?
Yes and no. So with breast cancer is a particular one. So breast cancer will come under that type 1 single gene testing. So we know BRCA1, we know BRCA2. Those are really well-known genes and variations that will be affiliated with certain increased risks of breast cancer. However, we've learned a lot more that there's actually variation within our genetics that will be affiliated with breast cancer, but is not encapsulated by the variation in BRCA1, BRCA2. And that's where polygenic risk scores come in. Dr. Tatiana Yates has done a lot of good work around polygenic breast cancer scores. I know some of it was pioneered at the Peter Mac Center in Melbourne, and that particular academic is now based in Brisbane. And there is work being done to see if we can actually start investigating that polygenic breast cancer risks and how that could be potentially put into clinical use for informing when people may be at higher risk.
And we will look at that will help us with prevention strategies.
It potentially helps with surveillance. So, for example, a previous friend and colleague who has since passed, there were 4 generations of breast cancer within the family, all under the age of 40, but they were all negative for the BRCA1, BRCA2. It suggested that there's a genetic variant there, but they didn't have it identified and didn't know what it was. But if they could find out which variations they were, there's the potential that you could screen earlier and get people into preventative streams earlier.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Interrupt. Those are the questions we love. Whole exome sequencing. Now, this will look for functional abnormalities, which may or may not help with diagnosis or treatment options. And we've also got the next step up from that, which is whole genome sequencing, and that can look at everything in a person's genome. It can often be used in the investigation of rare undiagnosed diseases, as well as increasingly being used to understand cancer. So there's rapid whole genome sequencing with rare conditions in children. So I know that the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne has been pioneering the rapid whole genome sequencing in NICU patients and do amazing jobs at what they can identify a patient. They go through the consent process, they do the testing and analysis, and are able to find potentially some answers to help with interventions and treatment. There's also the expanding work around cancer genomics, where individuals with advanced cancers or rare cancers can potentially have molecular tumor profiling, or even looking at germline or somatic mutations or changes which can then inform potentially for family members or for treatment options for that individual with the diagnosed cancer. So it has different ways it's being used in different areas. There's also biobanking and research testing. This can include SNP testing. It can be single gene, it can be whole exome or whole genoming. The research testing, again, kind of crosses all those different boundaries, and research messes up with a lot of our boundaries, how we understand stuff. So it's just going to kind of put it to the side a little bit. Research considerations for ethics and engagement will be different to clinical decision making, and I'll try to pull those apart. I can definitely address those at the end and the differences between the two. And we've also got, which is my world where I live in, is direct to consumer online genetic testing. This can be for a range of purposes and most often involves that SNP testing to create polygenic risk scores. The challenge is that the interpretation of the SNP results will cross those boundaries and return results about predictive testing for health conditions. It will look at allergy predictions. It can look at nutrition testing and the optimal diet you should be on for your genetics. It can investigate ancestry and somewhat ethnicity testing and family history tracing. There's also trait testing if you're looking at what type of sport you should be in. There's pharmacogenetic and genomic testing, which looks at your metabolism to certain drugs based on your genetics. Paternity testing, it is used for that within the courts as well as in forensic identification. And there's also fitness testing for people who want to optimize their training, or if they're actually scanning, elite athletes to find out what type of training can best support the players that they are, helping to achieve their best. The takeaway message is that there's a range of different types of testing out there. I'll probably come back to this, but particularly for the support and the conditions, it's likely that if genetic testing is being proposed for, someone you're supporting within your communities, it's likely going to be clinically indicated. Therefore, there's going to have a clinical reasoning behind it, and it's likely going to exist within the healthcare system. So that means that some of these won't apply, online DNA testing being one, but it's important to be aware that those options are out there. Veracity and use of them is still slightly left of center and questionable, but it is something that is out there to be aware of. And I'll come back to, the big bad internet and how that connects to that particular point later in the presentation. It's a story. Stay with me. I promise I will give you resolution. Now, when we think about this, we need to think about, okay, there's genetic testing, there's genomic testing. What type of information is this going to kind of result for us? And what do we do with it? So there's a range of different types of genetic and genomic information that can be generated or that we consider under this umbrella. Within the notes I've sent with you, there is a link to the Human Genetic Society of Australasia's position statement on the use of human genetic information in the healthcare settings. This does a really good job of unpacking how this different information can be generated and how it moves between different settings. Definitely a conflict of interest warning. I was part of the group that reviewed and produced that statement, so I am, highly leveraging from it, but it was done by such amazing academics and professionals and led by a genetic counselor who's embedded in the system and works within it. So we had a lot of different viewpoints when we came together. So thinking through the different types of information that's out there, there's clinical research or consumer genetic or genomic results and reports that can be generated. There'll be medical records, and that can be of a person and or a family and with a history of an inherited condition. That can all be considered genetic information. We have family trees or pedigrees, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there. There'll be consent documentation. Documentation. If there's one catchphrase that's going to be mine, that will be it for the rest of my life. It is very important. There's also going to be the potential for genomic data that can be raw or interpreted that might be embedded within records or available. There's going to be genomic data sets because for every person we test, we create data sets which potentially go into banks and how they're used or engaged with. There might be medical correspondence. Typo, thank you. It is medical. There also might be photography of physical features, as I'm sure some people might have experience with or might experience. Some features of how someone looks can indicate that something is going on, and they might need a photographic documentation of that to then help explain the logic behind how a diagnosis was arrived at, or potentially might be traced for treatment plans. purely thinking of my own experience with orthodontics, there are way too many pictures of my teeth out there, but that was part of the process. So I do want to come back to when we're thinking about genomic information, why do we worry about this? There's a big contested debate, and there's a range of arguments about whether or not genetic or genomic information is different from other types of information and whether it requires different levels of protection. This is an age-old debate, one that I see both sides of, and one I'm probably not going to be able to resolve for you today. But how we think about this information and the features of it will have an impact on the concerns that might arise, and potentially about plans that we need to put in place about how to manage it, or how to share it, or how to protect it to levels that, resonate with the person who makes those decisions. One of the things that's really interesting about genetic and genomic information is that there's a relational nature to this information. And by that, I mean that the information will tell you about the person being tested, but it's also going to be relevant to their genetic relatives. This information's kind of really challenging because it can be predictive. It means it can have an impact on people's futures. It can have an impact on future decisions. It can have an impact in terms of future behaviors or how somebody chooses to either engage with healthcare, their health, their lifestyle, their diet. All of those can have an influence. We've also got information we are generating that can be incomplete and or uncertain. And that status can change throughout someone's lifetime, which is also creating that kind of ongoing engagement with health systems or professionals in different ways. We have considerations about how and when it may be used. So information relevant at a certain time point in life might be highly relevant, and then it might sit quietly for a while, but then it might become important later in life. So for example, if you have a child where you're generating a lot of information about them, you're going to be concerned about treatment in their younger years and diagnosis and planning, and that's absolutely important. But then you might also generate information that's relevant to them either in their early adulthood, mid-adulthood, or later years, and it's important to think about that.
Can I, ask another question about that?
Absolutely. And
my question was about the relational nature of the information. Is that something that we could expect and should expect, that our health professional is taking families or individuals through at the time of consent, explaining all of those things?
That information will come up. It will be part of a genetic counseling session, and that is something genetic counselors are 100% across. They learn the stuff inside out. I will be the first to champion genetic counselors. They are superstars in this space, and if you ever get an opportunity to have a session with them, I would encourage that, because they know how to talk about the issues. They work on understanding it from different ways and communicating it to such a high, brilliant level that they are the superstars in the space. I do come back to that relational nature of information because that does have implications throughout the whole testing process. Thank you. Good foreshadowing. Excellent. Considerations about how it may be used, talking that it might have implications throughout life. And this comes to a central question, which I know a lot of people go like, okay, there's the ethics and the legal side. What does the law tell us about genetic information? What happens to it? And this is a great question. Now, I'm going to put a giant star that I'm talking about the Australian context, and particularly I'm going to go to the Victorian context. So there are legal protections for genetic or genomic information. And it's important that we think about the whole process here. So consent for testing results is often individually focused. And that is, informed consent is going to be focused on the individual being testing, what has resulted and what they want done with it. However, and this goes back really well to your question, Monica, good foreshadowing, that there is that relational nature. So what if through testing for an individual, there's results that are generated that have a high relevance to family members, potentially about a condition, a risk of a condition, or potential treatment and follow-up and surveillance that is required. This is where we have some challenges going on within the Australian context, but there is some guidance there. So the first level is that at the Commonwealth level, there's Section 95AA of the Privacy Act. Now, this was an amendment to the Privacy Act, and this is what it says, that there is an amendment to allow health practitioners to disclose patients' genetic information, whether or not they give consent in circumstances where there's a reasonable belief that doing so is necessary to lessen or prevent a serious threat to life, health, or safety of their genetic relatives. The amendments do not oblige disclosure of information, but provide the framework for this to occur under the appropriate circumstances. This often occurs when there might be family fracturing or separation, or perhaps discordance between a family, which happens more often than we like to admit, but it's also, there's ways that it can be managed. It's not a hard no, don't tell someone I absolutely don't want them to know. There's generally going to be engagement with health professional team, genetic counselors, family communication to see if those avenues can be opened. Often it can be that a family member, tested or something came up. We have testing that happened. Perhaps it indicated that they're at risk of something, and they say, hey, we've got information that's actually really relevant to your family members. This is how it maps out. Can we either have the contact details or permission to contact your family? Most people will work with health practitioners and professionals and say, yep, let's see what we can do. Now, it's not going to be that the health practitioner is going to phone up Susie or Joan and say, hey, we got, this particular relative's results, which is relevant to you, and we need you to come in. It's not going to be a disclosure in that way. It's often going to be a really, professional but kind letter from generally a family clinical genetic services going out to someone saying, hey, there's potential information available for you. We think you should come in and speak with us. Can we engage with you about your health to make sure that everything's okay? And that kind of gives the invite so somebody can come into the service and work with them. And then they can start talking through the processes and what their options are. Now, this particular setting is also really important because it applies to the clinical testing, but mainly applies to healthcare professionals working in the private sector and or Commonwealth institutions. So if they work in a state or territory public health entity, then they're bound by that jurisdictions, not necessarily the Commonwealth. So we have this disharmonization that happens. Therefore, you kind of need to go to your local state jurisdiction to provide guidance about what it does. The second important thing about this one is that it gives permission to health professionals in the system to do this. It doesn't oblige them. That's a really interesting kind of precarious position right now in terms of worldwide legislation and precedent where we are, because there is a case being determined in the UK right now where there's a potential argument that maybe the law should oblige health professionals that they should return this information to people. Australia is kind of taking a step back and we haven't gone that far yet. Yes, Danielle, you have a question.
Thank you. I was just, I guess, wanting to understand if there's any legalities in terms of adoption or surrogacy that crosses over into this, consent space as well, or right to know.
So that is also another challenging area. Great question. Right now, moving forward, they're trying to get a lot of open. They're trying to change it that it's going to be open adoption and open kind of not field, but disclosure of information. There's a lot of push right now by some donor conceived individuals that they would like to have access to whoever their donor was, and they'd like to be able to contact them. There still is a bit of resistance to say, yep, here's all the contact details, but they're trying to get as much information available to individuals. So say, for instance, there's someone who's donor conceived, generally health history and a lot of histories is going to be made available to them. So they can have all that information to hand. The actual identity of that donor, there's still different ways that can be set up. It usually comes down to how you set up that particular conception and contract. That some organizations will say, listen, we will give you the full health history, a briefing on what they physically look like and all the information that you could potentially know. But the particular setup we're doing is that you will never have their identity. There's a lot of pushback against that. And that's where a lot of individuals go to a lot of that online DNA testing and say, actually, we need to find this out. There's a really interesting program called the DNA Sleuths, which I do believe was covered on ABC out of Adelaide, where there's a group of donor conceived individuals who started using online DNA testing and were able to identify potential cousins and relatives of their donor so they could find out who they were and they could find other siblings and how they were conceived. There is a push to have open conception and open donor, so anyone who does donate is potentially identifiable. There's also the problem going back to early 90s, even to the early 2000s. A lot of records are being destroyed because some people said, listen, it was an anonymous donation. I don't want to be contacted at this time. So there is a huge tension between those who want to know and those who don't. And for those who want to know and those records are being destroyed, they're finding other avenues such as the online DNA testing to try to kind of get through some of those walls where they can. Coming back to legal precedent, I'm going to come to Victoria because that's where I am and what we know. There is some guidance by the Health Records Act 2001, where the Health Privacy Principle 2.2 is that an organization may not use or disclose health information about an individual for purpose, might be a secondary purpose other than the primary purpose for which the information was collected, unless that at least one of the following paragraphs applies. So 1, the organization reasonably believes that the use or disclosure is necessary to lessen or prevent serious threat to an individual's life, health, safety, or welfare. It is not specific to genetic information. This is actually a very broad concept and stipulation put in there, which it's the law. You need some room for interpretation. But that second qualification kind of creates a level of precedence that's hard. A serious threat to an individual's life, health, safety, or welfare can be hard to justify in the context of genetic or genomic information. For some, that might be a very serious and immediate that I need to get into testing, I need surveillance, and I need follow-up. Another might be you have information, but it may not apply for another 40 years. So there is that tension again about the immediacy of that information and how important it is to make decisions. The other challenge that we have is that the state and Commonwealth guidelines are not harmonized. So it's very important to think about the jurisdiction that you're within. South Australia does have some stipulations, Victoria does, New South Wales is a whole other case and context. Federation did some favors, not others. So it is very important to always think about the state and context that you're in and what applies. The guidance is there, but how that's interpreted and applied might change. And this is the question that I'm sure is coming up. It's like, what about insurance, health, travel, life? Please press pause. I am going to come back to this. So I do have information about that forthcoming. Again, foreshadowing, it will come up. All right, we need a bit of a pause. So let's come back to Mentimeter, please. And there is a short little check-in with everyone because I've been talking for 30 minutes and we get tired of my voice. I know that. I don't like listening to my voice some days. So if you could have a moment to go to Mentimeter and please fill in. Yes, I know there are very long meetings where I do online shopping. I'll fully admit that I'm guilty of that. Some old, some new, excellent, good. We want a combination of that. That's what's good. Needing a snack is okay too. Please do that. Why don't we take a 2-minute comfort break? I'm just going to have a quick drink. If you need to top up your tea, coffee, water, run to the toilet, please stand up, move. I am standing today, which is going to be a shock to my body, but that's okay. Sorry, thought it important. There are empirical data. That's the empirical data that's available.
Jacqueline, are you okay that I send out the workbook by email? Will you be using it throughout the session, or?
Absolutely, please send it through. I should not be allowed to make any more edits, and that's always a good thing. It needs to go.
Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, we are going to get started again. Glad everyone had a moment. I had to turn my heater off, you know, as much as I love my little hot boxed office, it gets a little too warm when I'm moving around. Moving on. So we are back. Now we get to the fun part. At least for me, it's the fun part, the ethics part. Ethics, as I mentioned at the beginning, can have a particular language around it. Some is familiar, other parts might involve new terms or concepts that you've never heard of, but they kind of make sense to you because you can think about what they mean, whereas others will have a very specific and narrow meaning. So over the next few slides, you know, this is going to be, again, a little bit of a base content, but I always like to be on the same page. I'm going to talk about what ethics is and is not. I know that this is one of my favorite questions at family dinner time, you know, what do we mean by ethics? And that causes some discordance some days. I'm also going to go through some ethical terms and language that I'll be using and try to come back to, or it will be terms that you'll hear from some health professionals or engaging in consultations, which might come up. And I've got a bit of a case for consideration, which I'm then going to use to kind of talk through the different ways that you potentially would support or help someone if they come to you seeking support, questions, clarifications, and the ways you can kind of think through the issue with them. So the big one, what do we mean by ethics? And this kind of goes back to how I learned it. It may not be the right way, but it's a way that I kind of like going back to. I also acknowledge that we need to go back to the, you know, old white dead dudes from Europe, because that is, you know, philosophy and where it all comes from. Is that right? Not necessarily. There's also some fantastic, amazing scholars these days. So, you know, read widely. That's my other kind of advice. So it goes back to Greek philosophy with ethics, and it's a study of what we ought to do. And it asks very fundamental, but actually quite challenging questions about how should I live and what should a good person do? No existential crises, at least, you know, for the next hour. After that, please help yourself, but we're going to pause for now. I also like to come back to it. This was really good because it connects to one of the words that was put up at the beginning. You know, we have ethics and morality, and they're often defined and used in similar ways, but they are separate contexts. So morality, I always go back to, are usually widely shared public or communal morals about right or wrong actions. If we think about our wider society, do not steal, do not hurt, harm others. I was going to say do not lie, but I'm very guilty of that, especially with family. So we'll just put that to the side. We've also got the idea about ethics, can be subjective or individual understandings of right or wrong. So even by those definitions, you see that there's tensions between individuals versus communities. It's not necessarily that, because there's going to be commonality. But when we think about individuals and ethics, that's where those values and preferences and context around people's lives, their lived experiences, and what they are experiencing is going to be fundamental to understanding and thinking about for them what is going to be an ethical choice for them at that time. I also really like going back to this idea about when we're defining what something is, we really need to think about what it is not. And these are the hard kind of standards that a lot and touchstones a lot of people come back to. Professional codes of conduct, those are ethics, go by those. Those are very particularly derived ideas from situations in time, social political influences, as well as we think about institutional influences about what we think is right or wrong. Professional etiquette, there's a lot of changes, and I always go back to the medical example because that's kind of a context I'm embedded within. That has changed over time. Professional etiquette for medicine at the earlier 20th century is very different from the mid-20th to is very different now. And sorry, I've got an audience of my 3 magpies on the fence staring at me. That'll be fine. We also come back to thinking about, you know, hospital policy or medical authority as well, that, you know, there are these authorities that will tell me what is right or wrong. They're going to give you some advice. They'll give you some perspectives. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will know what is right for you. Religion is very important for people in different ways, and I do not discount it at all. I think that is fundamental to conversations about informing how someone would like to live their life And so it's important to be part of the conversation, but religion may not reflect an individual's values. And they might actually be in a really hard position where they need to make a choice that goes against their religious values and views and how they have lived their life. So it can be a very challenging space to be within. As much as we love the law is not ethics, because we can do ethical things which are not legal, and there are legal things which we may not think are ethical as well. So there is a tension between those. And laws are often a function of a socio-political history and time. Great example that we're trying to change it this Saturday, something to reflect on, that sometimes the law doesn't reflect current ethics and values. Gut feeling, this is a fun one, especially when people come to and say, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right, but tell me why. And that's the challenge. Something cannot feel right, or there's an ick factor to it, but we need to think about why. What is it challenging? What value is it linked to? What experience, what judgment that we have around what is right or wrong? And we also have public opinion or concerns, or sometimes consensus. I know that there are large, societies where we think if majority says something, that's what we might go by. That doesn't necessarily work out sometimes. As we can see, the horrible instance of what happened in America for 4 years, there is that challenge and balance that, public opinion will tell you something about what people might prefer, but that might not actually reflect ethics or values at the time. And this is where I come to, and this is kind of the ethos, the way I look at ethics and bioethics, is that it's a space where discussion, communication, social relationships, and politics are allowed to contribute and shape the way we think and live. And it all comes back to asking that fundamental question of what we ought to do. And that space to me is very important, because it gives us a chance to hear alternative views and perspectives, and thinking about the context, thinking about if we're to make this universal and wide, what considerations do we need to be aware of? And I think finding that balance in that space is a really important place to have these days, especially if you're sitting in an uncertain place with a very challenging decision or dilemma you're facing. I'm going to switch now to ethical terms and language. This is where, some might smell familiar, some might be new. If anything is not clear, we're going to pause. I'm also going to pause in a couple of slides so we can reflect back if there's something I can unpack a bit further for you. Autonomy. It's going to be the stale word. We always come back to this. This is like, if there's ever a card to play in ethics, it's autonomy. Autonomy is often talked about as an individual, that individuals are self-governing entities. They should be free to make decisions for themselves that best align to their own values and preferences. This definitely is the Coles Notes version. There's definitely a philosophy behind this. It is definitely one of the most closely held values within medical practice, that the individual makes a decision and we abide by that decision. That's often something that's changed, that we focus on an individual. Now that can be very challenging, and especially if we think back to genetic information and the relational aspects, prioritizing an individual might actually make it very difficult to make a decision about genetic testing. This is where we have an idea that's called relational autonomy, where when you are making a decision, you might need to think about the consequences or impacts that decision has on others who are in a relationship to you in some way. For example, getting testing will have an impact on your genetic family members. So if I myself was to get testing, what I find out could have an impact on my siblings. It will have an impact about informing about my parents, and it could potentially have an impact on my nieces and nephews about the different genetic lines that they may or may not be connected to. And this is where in relational autonomy and decision-making, you might actually need to expand that sphere of who's included or consulted in that decision-making to ensure that we're actually thinking about the different impacts and consequences that might arise. When we think about decision-making, there's different ways that we think about it. For adults, it goes back to that autonomy. The individual will make a choice based on information they have and, how they think about that's going to the impact for themselves. When we have the challenge when we're thinking about decision-making for children, that creates another layer of complexity and challenge, especially if parents making a decision for a child. You can think that there's also, relational autonomy impacts that if you're thinking about getting your child testing, that's going to provide information about the parents. And there is that balancing challenge that a child shouldn't be used as a means to get testing to find out about the parents, with the parents not undergoing testing themselves. That's often where sometimes it might be proposed that if a child requires testing, they might also recommend or suggest the parents undergo testing as well, because that can help with clarifying some results that are required. It might also provide further information about what type of inheritance they're looking at. So it's not that, oh, it's going to be a default punch that everyone needs to be tested. There usually is a clinical justification and reasoning behind why more than one person is recommended for testing. We also think about for children, you're making decisions for someone, and it's going to be framed as in their best interests. Best interest is a great term because you're thinking about what's right, what's supportive, what's appropriate, but best interest can change. If you're thinking about for a child, when they're in their newborn phases or the first 5 years of your life, you can justify that we need testing, we need to make treatment decisions, and we want to make sure that our child gets the best care that we can. But in making that decision now, you might be generating information that needs to sit somewhere in trust, in a record, hidden or put away. And then it might delay that conversation that has to happen with this child when they become a late teen or an adult, saying, hey, there's this information we have about you. What would you like done with it? And that can be very confronting for, a young adult to say, something about me that I never knew. And, why did you make that decision? What was behind the reasoning that you made that decision at the time? And where is it now? How can I access? Will that have implications for my life? And that can be an ongoing conversation. And that's to think about that, what we think is best interest right now, that might change. We also think about this term informed decision making, which I know it sounds lovely and it makes a lot of sense, but it can actually be very hard. That, when you are making a decision, you want to make sure that it's going to be based on authentic, evidence-based information. The individual should be able to consider it and make sense of it. That means that it shouldn't be, here's a dump of facts, figures, and numbers. Please make a decision. I know that isn't always the process, and that can be very challenging, but it's also about having a chance that somebody gets this information, that they can take a step back and they can make that decision in their own time. And that they need to think about their values and preferences in making that decision. That's a very complex position to be in, about having information, having a decision, and then how you think through it and about what should be a consideration in that space. To be continued, we are going to unpack that. We also think about, when we are considering it, there's risks or harms and benefits. These can be framed as a risk or harm to the person who's undergoing testing. It can also be relevant to families, groups, or wider communities. Unfortunately, within genetics and genomics, there are huge histories of abuse, exploitation, and discrimination based on which group you may or may not be a member of, how those groups were exploited for information, how they are continually exploited in different ways. And it's important to think about those histories because that will influence how somebody might be coming to testing or that decision. It might also be a reflection of their wider community that they exist within and pressures that they might have to not undergo testing or to undergo testing in a very narrow remit. And it's also about, they may not want their community or family to know that they're undergoing testing. There's also amazing coordinated approaches to testing, which are phenomenal because they're community-led, they're community-owned, and the sovereignty sits with the community. One fantastic example are, the Ashkenazi Jewish communities in Sydney and Melbourne. There's such amazing coordinated secondary school testing programs that everybody knows what this testing is. It's accepted, it's normal practice, and the education and communication within there is second to none, that the way that they coordinate and do it. So as much as we see that there are communities that are negatively impacted, there are also positives, how communities have controlled and owned and taken over ownership of that. There's also some amazing developments happening, especially within Indigenous genomics in Australia, that there are national approaches to how it can be managed, community-led and community-directed, which it is changing, which is fantastic to see.
I think, Jack, just to jump in there as well, one of the things about risk that's important for in rare disease communities is that different people have different views about what risks they're prepared to take for themselves and their families. It isn't a one-size-fits-all decision that can be made.
Absolutely. And that's definitely, and to me, I go back to individual values and preferences, context of family, what is important, what are the pressures on making that decision will change what that is. So risks and harms and benefits, they're very broad terms, and they're going to be defined by the individual. Such an important point. It's not one risk for one is not a risk for another. Justice. Oh, this is close to my heart. Justice is a big concept. It can be a very hard one to define and to engage with. When we think about justice, we think about what is fair. Unfortunately, in our world, our society, and the systems that we all exist within and outside of, there's inbuilt systems of inequality and inequity. Those are going to be manifested in different ways, and different individuals will experience those in different ways. So when there is that recommendation for support or services or testing, it is important to remove and recognize our own implicit unconscious biases about what we think everyone has access to, because not everyone will have access to the same services. Not everyone has access to the same amount of time, the capacity, finances, or scope to understand, to ask questions, to engage. And therefore, it becomes such a fundamental part of the way we think about the world and how we navigate it. So me giving advice to someone might be completely off the mark because I'm not aware of thinking about their context and how they're existing in the world. And the good old ones we come back to all the time, privacy and confidentiality. Again, it's going to be a choice, and it's going to be very hard, because to an extent we can control our privacy and the confidentiality of our information and what's going on. But there are choices and ways in which information is generated, managed, stored, and accessed, which might be beyond our control. This is where we think about who's making the decision, who else needs to know about this information or what's going on, and if you need to, how will that information be shared? Some genetic and genomic information it's really important that it gets shared. Others can remain private and confidential, and that balance will be based on personal considerations. It might be based on medical considerations. And that's where I flash back to, when it's information that's relevant to family members, that they need it for particular treatment, surveillance, preventative matters, and therefore it becomes a different consideration decision. There could also be wider societal ones, that information, and this is where I really do recognize with rare diseases, there's such a solidarity that information should be shared, because the more we have, the more we can think about, and the more that we can do good research with it. And yes, that's good, but for some individuals, that might be a very frightening thought. For others, it might be not. If we do this, it needs to be all in or nothing. And there's a balance to consider there, because again, it's that reflection of the personal values and preferences and comfort. Risk for one may be an even bigger risk for another.
Can I ask, is that where a genetic counsellor comes in to be able to offer that sort of support for the different perspectives in a family setting, or is it more of a one-on-one counselling support service?
I would probably argue it's a combination of both. Genetic counselors, amazing. They do have that focus on the genetic testing and supporting in that context. There might be wider family communication structures and issues which go beyond the genetic counseling remit, where extra support might be required to help navigate, to help think it through, to help even mediate what needs to happen. And there is going to be a balance between the two. Genetic counselors might have access to individuals saying, actually, we can perhaps recommend someone who might be helpful. They might also be able to give you some tools to communicate to families. Genetic counselors are also very aware of the ways in which you might need to share or communicate information within your family as well. Bit of column A, bit of column B, but my response for that one. I'm going to pause for a moment. There's a lot of terminology in different ways. Some of it's going to play out in the following slides. Of the previous concepts noted, are any of them new? Do any of them require clarification? Can I go back to them for anyone? You can type in the chat box, you can raise your hand, whatever works. Monica, yes.
One of the things that I love that is a completely new way to think about the definition of ethics is the one that you shared about that it's a space, and it's a space where a safe discussion and a safety in thinking about the complexity of all of the pieces. I really like that, because I think we often think about things as you know, it's either this way or that way, and this is just so much more complex. And talking about the balance that you've also mentioned, and the role that communication and safe communication plays in finding that for yourself and for your family, your community. They're new, and I think just so thought-provoking. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's one that sits with my heart. I go back to it quite a bit because it's I know people want an answer, and that's my hardest thing. It's like, I can't give you an answer. I wish I could have an answer, but we can't. And sometimes the more discussion doesn't actually lead to an answer, unfortunately. It can just kind of create more and more discussion. But I think that diversity of discussion is important because the perspectives come in. And you mentioned a great word about the balance and the communication, which is why I go back to fundamentals of words, because how I use a word will be different how someone else uses a word, and finding that common language is important, especially when we get into technical terms in life, because they complicate it. Just acronyms are also that they do us a dirty, because they reduce that scope of what we're trying to understand, and we live in an acronym world, and I know that. I will tootle along because I also want to make sure I have time. So on the screen is a case for you to consider. Could you please take a moment to read? All right. Does anyone require a minute or 30 seconds more? See heads. Okay, I'm going to switch over to Mentimeter. I have something on the screen. If you could please respond to it, because I think this is an important kind of place to start. So this is mentioning that you are Maria. Wonderful. We're all in the middle. That's great. That's what we like to see. Short interlude. We will come back. Okay. Demean. There we go. See, I'm smarter than I look some days. Yes. Moving on. This, I believe, is probably going to be the crux of what people are thinking about they'd like to get from today's webinar. And I'm going to go through these each in turn. So, should I get a genetic test / genomic test? I imagine this is a big question that you might be faced with, or people come to, especially support groups, that you want to be able to offer that guidance and support to anyone who's looking for questions. This is not as straightforward of a question as we like to think, as I'm sure if you're thinking about all the stuff I've talked prior to this moment, you kind of go, I don't know where to go now. Don't panic. This is where I kind of like to step through questions and ways that we can think about it. First question always comes of who is asking. It's always important to go back to the person who is there. Tell me more. Should I get a genetic test? It's kind of the tip of the iceberg. Tell me more. There is more to this question. And then you ask, is the test for themselves, or is it for a family member or a child, parent, or sibling? They could be getting information, asking for a friend. Absolutely. And it might be a friend or a family member because they're not ready to ask that question, or they don't know which question to ask it. Also knowing, was the test recommended for them? Did they find out about their networks, contacts, or were they researching online? All that gives you a little bit more information about the context, because there's always going to be something going on. And, do they know which test they're thinking about and why? So, if we're thinking about if you're Maria and, Leslie came to you, thinking about what your answer would be. If we're thinking about the ethical implications, and this is where I go back to that being curious, tell me more. Tell me more about what you're asking, because that's one question, but there's others behind it. And that's where I go back. It's important to understand the content, the perspective, the factors that might be influencing the decision or discussion. Leslie might be coming to you because Marcel doesn't want to talk about it. Just, it's something, we'll just do it. Whereas Leslie might say, well, actually, I want to think through what's going on. It could be about, what information we're giving. What about the sports? What was available to you? How did your conversation go with the genetic counselor? What do you remember from it? And they might go, it all happened so fast, I don't remember, but I have all these pamphlets. What do I do with them? And that's like, okay, so we have a few things. You're given some information. We might need time to process that. Let's talk through what's going to happen. Now, this is where I kind of frame my approach to it as before testing, during testing, and after testing. This is just purely how my brain works. I go logistically through the different considerations. Other people might approach it in different ways. So I always go for the consideration. Okay, before testing, why the tests? That kind of always go like, oh, we need a diagnosis. We're doing clinical investigations. They need more information. Or, they told me we're doing a test. It's not going to give us an answer, but, they need to get some information. Thinking about how it will be done. Is it going to be invasive? Is it a blood test? Is it, a cheek swab? Those might have implications. A child with a cheek swab, that could be a lot easier than actually got to go in for a big needle. Our child hates needles. This is going to be a fight. What are we going to do? Thinking through what the potential outcomes are. I know we don't have crystal balls. You can't predict everything, but it's important to start thinking about what's going to happen. What happens next? Thinking about what types of results you might get. Is it results that's just relevant to the person we're getting tested? So is this result just relevant to Jamie? Is the result potentially going to have an impact on Jasmine? Will it inform potentially about Marcel and Leslie's, carrier status? And will that have knock-on implications for if they were to have a third child and how they need to make decisions there? Also thinking, is it an inherited condition where we need to think about our genetic relatives who might need to be informed that we're doing this testing for Jamie and that they potentially need to go talk to clinics? Having those initial conversations and being mindful of how that connects, that's where that relationality comes in, how that might relate to others. It's not necessary you need to activate all those phone lines to family members, but being aware that you might have information that has to be disclosed kind of helps you think through, well, is this a risk or is this a benefit? And that's where you need to think about risks and benefits and what they mean for Marcel and Leslie at that time. Who you need to talk to about testing. That's where you do ask, do you need to talk about this with family members? Marcel and Leslie, are you both having conversations about this? Do you need to have a conversation about that? Are you hesitant about testing? If Marcel's fully on board, do you have a space to kind of think through your, why you might be hesitant, what you're worried about? Are there health professionals that can step you through testing? You mentioned you talked to a genetic counselor. Do you need to perhaps talk to them again? Is there further clarification that you can seek from them that will give you further information? Or is there potential counseling that you need to get, which is separate to the testing, that is going to help you manage what's going on? Because it's an anxiety-filled process. It's not a simple medical test. This is actually a big decision to make. Are there steps that you should take prior to testing? I'll come back to this one because it links to my giant bold at the bottom there. And also, what if you choose not to test? That's an option too, as much as people say, no, testing was mentioned, we have to do it. You don't have to. There are other choices, and it is important to consider those, that if you choose not to test, are there alternatives available? A friend whose child had indicated for things, they said, we were recommended not to do genetic testing by the clinician because it had insurance and health implications. This is in a different jurisdiction, and therefore we actually strategically thought about different ways that we could find information out, which actually wasn't that the test was done, we have an answer, and that was able to inform treatment in a different way. So it is important that just because there's a test doesn't mean you have to do it. Now, this goes back to my prior to testing. One main concern with testing is the impact on insurance, and this very much is a prominent concern and something to think through. So, we're going off track just for a couple slides. Bear with me. Genetic and genomic testing in Australia and insurance. So currently there's a few developments to be aware of. The first one is private health insurance and some forms of personal insurance, such as provided by superannuation funds. They're what we call community rated, which means regardless of any family histories, you will all pay the same premium, regardless of the individual health status or risk factors. That's important. Your health insurance is not impacted by genetic testing. It's community rated. Second thing to be aware is that there are personally rated products that can be impacted by it. This can include travel insurance, life insurance, and some forms of income protection insurance. Within Australia right now, there was a industry-led moratorium led by what's called the Financial Services Council. That's the guiding body for the insurance regulation in Australia. And they all together consciously made a decision that in any life insurance underwriting policies for less than 500,000, genetic test results cannot be used to inform them. But if you do have a policy above that, they potentially can use results to inform the underwriting process. This particular moratorium is in place until 2024. And there's actually been some research done in Australia to look at discrimination, stigma, and what impact genetic testing might have on insurance, or how that potential challenge of insurance being impacted by genetic testing would impact someone's choice to undergo testing. So there is a push right now to have a permanent ban introduced as legislation. In the workbook, there's a link to the current position statement from the Human Genetics Society of Australasia. And I think there was also a link to some of the ongoing work done by the A. Glimmer group for a medical research future fund that was funded to do the work. So that's great. That's a nice context note, but what do we actually say about it? So there's some really good guidance from the position statement, and it's in italics because I took this directly from there, and there's more details in there if you'd like to follow up. Things to note. So for individuals with a family history of genetic condition, family history alone is likely to impact an application for personal insurance products. Because as we know, family histories are important. They can often tell us a lot more than any genetic testing, because you can look at generations and expression and symptoms, severity, age of onset. That will actually inform quite a lot about your health. Okay, my own family history, that raises a lot of questions, but that's another topic. We also think that genetic testing can either confirm an individual's family history or return the individual to a population level risk. So whilst it can work to say, hey, you're at increased risk, you need to do something, it can also confirm that, no, you're not at increased risk. So, you're at the population level risk. You can calm down, it's okay. For individuals with no family history of a genetic condition, there's a possibility that testing may reveal a previously unknown genetic variant, which may impact implications for personal insurance products. This is where we think about screening. Screening is done at a population level on asymptomatic individuals. Therefore, it may actually pick up someone who might have an increased risk but not know about that. And there's also the final point that, individuals have an obligation to disclose genetic test results to insurers when applying for life insurance products. It's in the terms of policy, and that's if the terms of the policy exceed the moratorium thresholds. So there is that obligation that, say, if I went to go get a insurance policy for $650,000, I would need to disclose the types of genetic testing I've had and my results. So this is part of that prior to testing. Are there personal insurance products that you need to put in place and set up prior to testing? And that is often some of the advice that is disclosed to individuals. Be mindful of that one, that if there is that family history there, that might actually be a factor to consider. Now, going through the process, we think about the considerations during testing when you're waiting for the results. What happens if you change your mind? You can make a choice to say, actually, I don't want these results and we don't want them. That is a choice. I know it's not one that's probably widely popular or advertised, but it is part of that choice. You have that autonomous choice to say yes or no. And it is important to be supportive and to give someone that opportunity to say, if you are that uncertain and you don't want it, you can choose not to get the results, or you can choose not to proceed. That leads to conversation with your healthcare practitioners, and that the results, we don't want them. You might have a discussion, say, actually, we don't want the results, but if they need to inform our treatment, can you please do that and use that behind the scenes? So there are ways to make those decisions. Now we're into the post-test considerations. What does it all mean? Finding out what the information results, what the results are, and what do they mean. That what do they mean can be very important. It can be, we got some results, they indicate you're at a higher level. This is the treatment or care plan we can recommend. The results were inconclusive, therefore we're going to work with what we know. Here are the options that we are thinking. That's not a loss, that's not a bad thing. There's an immense amount of clinical reasoning and thinking, and there's a huge creativity to the way that modern medicine uses all the tools at their availability to help inform treatment and care plans for individuals. It can be disheartening where results don't give you an answer, but it doesn't mean that they aren't trying their best. And that's where it comes down to. Results may come back uncertain, saying, we found something, we don't know what it means. It could be productive, it could be potentially, causing concern. We don't know. And that's very, very hard statement for a lot of health professionals to say, we don't know. Especially within genetics, this is an area where there's a lot that we don't know. The greatest metaphor and image that someone ever said is that, imagine a fire hydrant with all the water splashing out. Our ability to understand is standing there with a little colander trying to scoop up the water. Some days it feels like that's how you're trying to understand the vastness of all the information available. Other people have a really great hose that they connected up and they're filtering it, and they can actually say, here's some clean water you can drink. There's different levels of our understanding, and that can be a very challenging. And I think through someone who has a child, a parent, a sibling, a family member, or themselves who is facing this, and they need to think about what my options are and what this information means. And that's where it is about, let's think what this means. If you do get information back, and that's where it goes back to that pre-test, which family members do you need to call? Are you ready to share this information? If you're not ready right now, that is okay. Do we have a plan for later if you would like to share it? Would you like to hand off that responsibility to a healthcare professional and provide those contact details, which is an option as well? Fabulous systems have been set up, particularly I know in South Australia, they do it very, very well, and they will take that burden from you and manage it. Having those options available is important to be aware of. We also think about the information and kind of its relative importance. It is important now, it is important in the immediate future, is it far into the future? And which bucket can you put it into? If there is a lot of decisions that need to be made now and it's information in the future, you can put it in the bucket for later. That is okay. We all need to manage and triage what we're doing. It kind of is almost someone giving you permission saying you don't need to worry about this right now. And that is a really useful tool. Because someone says you don't need to worry, we will talk about it later. It's a huge burden off of your shoulders. The next part I think about is, how will that information be stored? Is there a plan for access that needs to be managed? For example, if there's information about a child's results and it's information they need later in their life, how will it be stored? Is it just going to go into their record? Will it go into their record with a little bit of a label or storage saying, do not open? Because we can imagine we're creating a lot of information right now, especially around children. And if they're 16 going to their GP and the GP says, oh, you've got this variant, and they go, excuse me, I did not know I have that. Can you please explain? And that potentially leads to challenges of how that information gets relayed or communicated. There's also the challenges that if someone has a terminal diagnosis, how will information be managed after their passing? If you've got a spouse that's managing information, that information may not be directly relevant to the spouse, but it might be relevant to, the genetic children of that individual who passed away. How is that information going to be gatekept, managed, and how is access going to be enabled? And it comes back to that more immediate concern. Are there care treatment decisions that must be made based on results? And who do you need to talk to? Do you need time with your family? Do you need time with your clinicians? And who do you need to ask about, what this means? And putting those questions in the context of what are, the context, what are the capabilities, and what other pressures might be influencing those decisions. I'm going to come to these on the next slide. This is my ethics and stuff where I come back to it all. First one is ethical dilemmas will arise. And it always helps to start from a position of you're not going to aim for an outcome. I have no attachment to an answer or an outcome when I look at cases. And this is where I go back to that first case, what we ought to do. Sometimes that's an easy answer, sometimes it's not. But in that journey, it's important to go through different things. There's different options that people present, favor, or think about will be connected to their deeply held personal values or concerns. And that's where it is about asking that question. So that's where I come back to the context. It might be very specific. So for example, if we go back to that Marcel and Leslie, they may be facing financial pressure. So having to miss work to attend several clinical appointments might be stressful for the family. So they want to decide quickly and not have to repeat consultations. That could be behind Marcel saying, just do the test, we'll come in next week, it's fine. Whereas Leslie might want that space and time to think about it. Again, I come back to this, there are no right or wrong answers. Even when we deeply disagree, it is that neutral position we start from. It can help individuals, families, and groups think through the possibilities and discuss how each option resonates with their own values and preferences. This can lead to asking questions, we can seek out clarification, or we can seek out further information. It's all kind of part of that process. And I imagine in that support role, you want to be part of someone as they go through that. You're not directing, but you're given that clear support saying it's okay. Like I don't know where to go for questions. Here's some potential options. Some might work for you, some might not, but I can help you find out what would be helpful. This is where I do come back that healthcare professionals are important because they're good sources of authentic information that's evidence-based to help support their decision-making. So much research and behind the scenes background work goes into getting resources together, making sure they work. I know sometimes you look at them and go, no, not a good idea. And that's okay. But there usually is some justifications and reasoning behind it. I know we may not always understand or agree with them, but there has been a lot of work going into there. And if that particular format, platform, paradigm, way it's been delivered to you doesn't work, then say so and say, this doesn't work. The pamphlet's not working. I need to talk to someone. That can be supported. And there are ways to make sure that we can get that information in a way that works. Beware of the internet and quick answers. We are all guilty of it, myself included. Dr. Google. It is a great tool for finding information, but a lot of it can be white noise, especially when you're thinking about decisions that have impacts beyond what's right here. And the context can be emotional, they can be stressful, and they can be scary. And unfortunately, the internet and all those quick answers can add to that anxiety, often not in a good way. For some people, the way their brain works, it actually reassures and gives them a way to think it through. Again, everyone approaches it differently, but it is that sheen of warning it. If you are going to think about this, make sure you're using it in a productive way and you have a tap out. You have a point where you know you need to tap out and say, no, no more. I've reached what I've got. It's also a really useful tool, and this is where the benefit comes from, is that you can find out ways of thinking about it if they haven't thought about it in that way before. For example, insurance implications and concerns around discrimination, or thinking about if testing is done on a child, how we're going to manage this information, how we might disclose it to them in the future. That might not be a concern sometimes, and so it becomes important that we think about that. Discussions might be there to help families or individuals sort through their feelings, thoughts, and options. And often there I come back to, and this reflects back to my idea of ethics as a place for discussion. Support discussions are about supporting deliberations around the different factors that are impacting the decision that they need to make. So it may not be a discussion needs to have an outcome. It could just be a discussion there to give someone that space to think through things aloud. And that's where I come back to. Probably my final point is that a discussion is a personal one, but it can also have implications for others. And therefore having that support space where you can identify the options, think about the considerations. It is all part of that ethical unpacking and giving space to it. That's why you're here. That's why you're there, to support those discussions. It is I'm here to support you. How can I help you think through these questions? Here are some concerns I can give you to think about. And I don't have it, like, not having an investment in an answer or a solution is also really good. It's the conflict of interest. I don't have, I'm not married to whether you do or don't do testing, but we'll talk through all the options to make sure that you have time to think about it. So coming back to our case and what you're thinking about it, I will flick to Mentimeter for the last time. Now that we've gone through different ways that ethics can come into it, have a think. How confident do you feel you would be? Take two, I call it, in the post of the different ways that you're thinking about it. Oh, we had an increase. We landed on 3.5. We're at 4. Empirically, that's good. I know there's a lot of thoughts behind all that, but it's a lovely, nice place for us to end today. Got, I think, 1 or 2 more slides. We have 20 minutes, so there's time for discussion. I always like to check in. What concepts or ideas or slides can I revisit and provide clarification? Is there a concept that's still confusing, or you lost me 10 slides ago? Please go back. I tapped out. The online shopping, the blouse was really cute. I'm totally on board with that. Buy it. How can I help? Monica.
So I have a question around that yes, the ethical journey is a personal journey, and people may or may not have thought about the implications of whether they will ever find themselves going down this particular pathway, in terms of the community that we're that we are most familiar with. So it's more about the professional relationship of the, so as appointments get more and more pressured, and this is something that we were kind of talking about before we started. So the pressure is on health professionals to see more patients, to have faster discussions, to be more efficient for whatever that means in their time. And as we do that, then we get, or do we get, I guess, less time being given to explore where that family is or where that individual is in their capacity and capability to be able to take themselves down that path. Does that make sense?
Yep. So it's going to be about how much the onus is put on the patient, saying, we've given you information, I've given you the primers, I need you to think about it. Now I need you to come back to me with the questions that are most important because we have a limited time, and therefore I'll cover them for you. And that's where I think that disservice of the shorter appointments is there, because it doesn't give you that space. And that's where, if I had to put it in my mind, I think between a potential patient going away with all these pamphlets and questions and not knowing where to start, that's potentially where I see the support services saying, okay, let's unpack what you're thinking about. What did you understand about that information? Because when you walk away with your handful of pamphlets, you don't know what's important. And I think it's about having that time to read, to think. And that's where it's the sniff test. This pamphlet wasn't useful for me, but that pamphlet you threw away might be the most important one. It's also going to be about having that one-on-one discussion. And I think it is about where are you sitting with this? What is impacting what you're thinking about right now? Saying, okay, well, what about family? Well, what do you mean about family? How does this relate to my testing? It's just us. And that's where it's like, okay, well, genetic testing will have impacts. You might need to think about who you need to talk to about it. Is it going to be your brother and sister-in-laws? No, because they're potentially not a part of the family, but it is about thinking what it means and how it all connects.
I think as well that says the pathway and the pathway into connecting with patient support organisations becomes even more important. That connecting with other families becomes even more important. So it kind of reminds us at the GSNV of how critical it is to ensure that we are connected to health professionals in a way that's saying, hey, you have to be talking about us, because the patient community and the individuals who are sitting in front of you have these significant decisions that they may be seeking to make. So that just reminds me of the importance of our role, I think.
Absolutely. And there's different ways, because it's also, it's really, it scares me, because I don't want the push to be that healthcare professionals saying, talk to the community support, they're there, because that then takes away, they're trained to do that. They are experts in that. You please spend the time supporting the patients there, because ideally a patient would come to you and have conversations. But if the support groups are there at the beginning, having to go back to the basics, which should have been covered by the healthcare professional, that's suggesting a huge gap in care. And that's potentially creating opportunities where patients might walk away from those appointments and go, this is too hard, this is too much, and I don't understand what's being asked of me right now. And that's where you get lost to follow-up. And I do think about the context that this is a geographically huge country. And if someone is not within a metropolitan with easy access, that's another increasingly hard barrier to get there. Before I go down too far into that rabbit hole, Danielle.
No, I just wanted to second what Monica was saying, like in terms of having a lived experience as well. Like you walk into a medical appointment and you're not prepared for that suggestion. And I guess it's just by luck that I work with GSNV and could ask the right questions. But it sort of made me see how you earlier, I think one of your first slides was the different genetic tests that are available. And my insight was, oh, it can be as easy as, here's a blood test, go to the blood test area and get it done without any sort of ethical considerations. And the onus is on the individual to come up with questions very quickly, because these are like 10-minute appointments. And then the next appointment would be a 6-month review or something. So it's not, it's not an immediate follow-up when you are having specialist consults, right? And I just kind of feel that, yeah, there's the support group network needs to understand the whole range of discussion points and consideration points. But I'm interested in how the medical professionals handle or have room to understand a little bit more what it means when you just simply fill out a blood test form that looks like every other blood test form, but it has such an implication in terms of, the key questions you've asked today about family, about insurance, about finding something else out that you weren't prepared for. And I go back to, again, because I know the network, hey, I could actually go, well, hang on a second, I think I need to be given more, like access to a genetic counsellor. But if I hadn't asked, that wouldn't have been offered. And I get worried about how many others get lost in that system. So bit of a comment question in there.
So many thoughts. Lots of thoughts on this. One of the big ones that I probably come back to, and it seems mean, but for me, it goes back to the health professional. If you are recommending a test and you're signing that form, don't just sign, go get this test done to your patient, especially in the genetic sphere where there's a huge scope for things to happen. And that's where I do sit with, I lecture to medical students and I say, these are concerns. You are going to be a generation where genetic testing will be in every specialty. Please be aware of what this is. And you raised a really great point there, Danielle, that I got the test done, but we didn't consider things till we got results 6 months down the road. And those are important conversations to have before testing, during testing, and after testing. And I always go back to that, this engagement's a process. It's not, and that's where I come back, like consent. I signed the form, therefore it's done. No, that's a process, because you can choose not to have it moving forward. And you need to continuously think about what it is. Circumstances may change. Family relationships may change. The way in which family shares information might change. Other life events or health scares might change the way family wants information at a time. And our systems are so archaic that it's the one way, here you go, get the test, we have the results, that's it. But it actually needs to be a lot more ongoing engagement. And I know that's a huge ask because workforce implications, we have limited time, there's limited people available to support. And if we are going to put a lot more genetic and genomic testing into our healthcare system, we also need the capacity to support that. Because as much as, yeah, it's a great tool, it's an amazing tool, but we don't have the workforce and the capacity to support that yet. And that workforce and capacity also needs to be at that competency level where they can consider these and have those conversations with our patients and say, we need to think about this, or we need to think about this here, or I actually need to talk about these key points with you right now. I don't want an answer, but I need you to think about them. That's where they might say there's also support networks who might be able to talk through them with you. The support networks won't give you an answer, but they'll give you a sounding board to talk through your options. And then if you need to come back for another consultation with your core questions, we can go through them. And I think that back and forth conversation is important. That conversational aspect, it gets lost in so much of what we do because it's a one-way transaction to tick the box and get the next person in and the next person. And that's where, you know, our system does us a huge disservice in that way. But if we can actually build in those checks and balances where we can actually create that engagement, it's really good. I know that's a blue sky Pollyanna thinking because there's so much other stuff and complicating factors going on. But at least from an ethical point, I look at it that way. Or I also look at clinical ethics services that are available that can help talk through ethical dilemmas, which usually once a lot of things are done very wrong, then we finally call in for help, unfortunately. But it gets to that point where that team can step in and say, let's unpack what's going on. Just also seconding for everyone, the survey is in the chat. Please go on and complete it. It's really helpful for GSNV so they can continue delivering amazing stuff like this for you.
Thank you so much. I have another question. You mentioned right at the start about references to materials that you would make available. I've been invited to join a consultation for the Victorian Government on a service review of clinical genomic health services that they're just about to start. And part of it is like, what would the ideal service, genomic health service, look like? And I think some of the things we've talked about today are hugely should be huge parts of what we are feeding into an excellent service from a patient and consumer point of view would need to look like in genomic health. So I would love to look at some of those references that you referred to, and any other things that you would like to, or direction you would like to point me in, so that I can contribute in a very useful way to that consultation.
And absolutely have a chat with you that I have many thoughts.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's do that. Do we have any other questions? I'm conscious that we are looking at the time.
I just wanted to make more of a comment, I guess, coming back to the last discussion point. I'm a genetic counsellor, by the way. Hello.
Hello.
Really interesting topic today. Got me thinking about a lot of parts of my practice, I guess. I've worked in public health and in private testing, and I've worked in clinics in person, and I've worked in telehealth as well. And I've done testing for single genes, and I've done testing for panels with like 300 genes on them. And I think it's really interesting because I've worked in services where you have an hour or more with a client before they do testing, and you can really sit down with them and talk about, this is what we're going to be this is what's been suggested for testing by your doctor. So I've worked in the cancer space for a long time. We're looking at doing this testing because of your diagnosis. This is the implications it could have for you, but also for your family. These are what the results might be. If we get this result, this is the treatment we might consider. If we get that result, that's the treatment I consider. And there's a lot of time to kind of sit down and talk about all of that stuff, which a lot of clients would feedback and say, look, it's really amazing that we've had this time to talk about this, because cancer diagnosis in particular can be such a whirlwind. Oh, you've got cancer, you've got to start chemo tomorrow, and you've got to do this and you've got to do that. And they kind of often feel like they're on this train that they can't get off. And they just, so they often say that they found it really valuable to sit down with the genetics team, because it's the first time they've actually been able to, someone's asked them about their diagnosis and their process, and they're able to kind of have that discussion. But then I've also been at the other end of the spectrum, where I've been in the private, my most recent job was in private carrier screening. So lots of couples would come to us from their obstetrician or from their IVF clinic, and they say, look, do this. It's part of a suite of tests we'll do as part of early pregnancy testing or as part of early IVF testing. And most recently, they didn't even talk to a counsellor before results came. They got a lot of written or online interactive content, but I saw them for results, and that was the first time we talk. And they're like, we didn't even have an opportunity to discuss. We just did it because our doctor said to do it. And And so they're kind of blindsided by a lot of the things we then end up talking about in results. And I've had people that have decided not to have testing because they've had that conversation before, or who might not have had testing had they had that conversation, or decide not to have testing and then go back to see their obstetrician at the next appointment, and the obstetrician's like, where are your results? And they say, oh, well, we didn't do the test. And then they come back to us because they've been, you know, like chastised like they're a naughty child and told to come back. So it's really interesting thinking about I guess what the genetic counselor's role is in all of that, in helping them consider all those different things and think about things that they might not think of themselves. So, you know, some people go, oh, I didn't think that my results would have implications for my family, which we think in genetics might be really obvious, but, you know, some people don't think of that. But also where your professional boundaries are. So, you know, you're helping this client make the best decision for them. So the person that decides not to have testing, but then you have this other health professional who on the hierarchy of health professionals, because that definitely exists, has more clout, I guess. And they're saying they should do it. And then, so then clients get caught in the middle sometimes, you know, knowing what's best for them versus what they should be doing, based on, you know, some other health professional's opinion. So anyway, it can be a tricky space to kind of manage and hold all those balls in the air at once. That's all. That's my comment.
No,
They're very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you for that. That is, those are the on-the-ground perspectives, which are so fundamental to, like, yes, I can do the theory and the practice, but on the ground, it's like this, in theory, that's a great idea. This doesn't work in practice, and knowing that, and that medical authority to say it's the test, do the test. And it's unfortunate. I understand the reasoning, I understand the justification, the clinical reasoning behind it, but sometimes people need to make that choice, and we need to be okay with that.
Steph, thank you so much for bringing a little person to the meeting, but also for sharing your thoughts.
Two little people.
Two little people.
There's one.
That's so cute. Thank you. And there's another one.
There's another one.
Oh, look how gorgeous.
Oh.
If and please don't feel obligated, but if you would like to drop a couple of paragraphs that are just on your reflection, that we could maybe use to encourage other genetic counselors to watch,
sure,
that would be awesome. And we might think about how we could perhaps do a webinar at HGSA or something with HGSA as well. Just something to think about. But the comments that you've made, because I found it incredibly thought-provoking, but to have a GC as well say, hey, that actually took me down some paths I didn't expect. Then, Jacqueline, I think you have ticked every box, which is fantastic. But if we could then take it forward, I think that would be like a hugely important thing to do. So I would love it if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. We there's also a weekly newsletter that the ASGC the society puts out, which lists webinars and recordings and things that are of interest to. So you guys should get in there somehow, and you know, with with today because you're recording, but with your future sessions, you could get in on that, and then might have more people join up.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We will take that on board. And on that note, do we have any further questions, or can we just? I can't see everybody. Thank you. No, so could we just thank Jacqueline so much for everything that you presented to us, and the gymnastics, I think, that you have taken us to, which is hugely important for how we support the patient community, and it's critical that we're all working together and all thinking about what are those key things that communities, that individuals, that families need, and how can we bring them together, and how can we influence better practice and better lived experience. And this is just another example of us working together to do that. So absolutely sincere thank you from us, but also our broader community, who will get enormous value from the journey that you've taken us on. Jacqueline, thank you.
Thank you. It was a joy. I always enjoy presenting. If I can get ethics into every conversation about genetics, my job is done.
Well, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and we will see you at our next event, which is next week. Please look out for our social media posts. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.